Welcome to another episode of Witty CFB. Your host Rob Sheply here, and on today's episode, we are going to be doing another Big Ten matchup, perhaps the biggest matchup of the entire weekend, where Ohio State is going to be traveling to Eugene, Oregon, to travel to face the Oregon Ducks, number 2 versus number 3, a matchup that I think every college football fan in the country will be watching, will be excited about, and I think for the most part, this is a relatively even matchup. I think for anybody who's followed Oregon and Ohio State throughout the season, to me, the storylines of this game are pretty obvious. For me, the two things that this game's going to come down to, the three things, it's going to be pretty much two things here. Number one, it's going to be in the battle of the trenches. You have Ohio State's offensive line versus Oregon's defensive line. And then secondarily, the other biggest storyline is going to be, can Will Howard live up to this moment? At K State, is he a solid quarterback? Yeah. He so far this year, he's done everything he has to do in order to put Ohio State in this situation. They haven't faced too good a competition. They faced Akron, Western Michigan, but they both Oregon and Ohio State have both played Michigan State, which I find to be fascinating in a couple of regards too. And on the flip side of that, you think of Dylan Gabriel too, who's athletic. He knows how to use his feet. He slings it down the field, and he's had some big game moments too, especially when he was at Oklahoma last year. He beat Texas in the Red River rivalry game. So he is accustomed to these sort of moments too. And I do think a lot of the there's going to be I think there's a lot more pressure on Ohio State to win this game, not only because of Will Howard and because of Ryan Day in general. He's had a lot of pressure over the years to finally get over to the hump and win a national title. But I mean, most importantly, I'll break both of these teams down now. I'm going to start off with Ohio State since they're on the road. In my opinion, they're definitely the most talented team in the entire country. There's no doubt about that. I love this team for a number of reasons. First and foremost, the two-headed monster that you have in Travion Henderson and Judkins. They're so much fun to watch. They've scored 9 touchdowns together, approximately 9 rushing touchdowns, 900 yards combined. And I think if you're Ohio State, I would strongly anticipate them to be, to be really running the ball a bunch, to really have a balanced attack too. Because too, you have Aduka, you have Jeremiah Smith. There's just so many weapons on this Ohio State offense that Oregon's going to have to contend with too. And when you look at this full circle too, this is even a big coming home game for Chip Kelly. He was at Oregon for a number of years. This is his first year at Ohio State, and he was head coach at UCLA for a number of years. And I think most importantly than anything, this is just as much pressure on Ryan Day, but it's also a lot of pressure on Chip Kelly too. He's when he was at UCLA, he got a lot of criticism, primarily because he just refused to recruit whatsoever. Even at UCLA, you can kind of tell towards the end of his tenure that although he is one of the best offensive masterminds in all of college football, and there's no doubt about that he knows how to maximize his quarterbacks. He's coached a lot of successful quarterbacks throughout college and in the NFL. But when it really comes down to it, I think the big question I'm looking forward to seeing is, how's Ohio State going to come out of this game? Is Ohio State going to be kind of what we saw in the first couple games of the year, where we saw them with kind of more balanced attack, and then Will Howard throws for, he threw for about 275, somewhere in there. And for the most part, didn't really make him do too much, because all in all, Will Howard hasn't had to face any elite secondaries like he's had to do this. I wouldn't say Oregon's necessarily an elite secondary, but certainly a well more than what they've seen, especially compared to the Iowas and the Michigan States and all that too. But if you're Ohio State too, I think if you're Chip Kelly, I think one of the things you're going to have to prepare for, which I'll allude to more when I talk about Oregon, is I think you're going to have to anticipate that they're going to make Will Howard try to throw the ball, because the one thing that Ohio State did get some criticism for is they pretty much let Kyle McCord go for Will Howard. I mean, it depends on which source you hear from. Some people are going to tell you that they kind of, told Kyle McCord to leave and they brought in Will Howard, or other people are going to tell you that, Kyle McCord saw that Will Howard was coming in, so he's like, hey, I'm not going to sit back up anyway, and I might as well go to Syracuse and at least have one final strong senior year and go off to the sunset and do that. But this is such a big test for a number of of really all of Ohio State. Whether you talk about Chip, you can look at it from the Chip Kelly angle, you can look at this from the Ryan Day angle, you can look at this from Ohio State just being the most talented team in the country and them having their first real legitimate test of the entire year angle. And also you can look at this from the Will Howard angle of, you know, what sort of reads or what sort of looks are we going to see from Chip Kelly? I anticipate seeing some unique looks. I think we're to get some variety. I anticipate them them having Henderson and Judkins as a big part of the game plan, but at the same time too, you have to think to yourself, from now kind of shifting to Oregon a little bit, the real problem that Ohio State's going to have, that I think many people are overlooking perhaps, is yes, Oregon has an incredible defensive line. They have they're loaded in terms of talent. But I think what makes Oregon's defensive line a little bit different compared to some of the defensive lines that, some of the strongest defensive lines that you see elsewhere in the country, like, like Penn State, like Michigan, you see Mason Graham before. He's so much fun to watch. Compared to those defensive lines versus Oregon, I think what distinguishes Oregon the most is the fact that I think Oregon's defensive line has multiple ways to attack you. And what I mean by that is they're so darn athletic, and they're not just going to bull rush you and go in. You know, they're they're going to try to do some swipes, they're going to do some spin moves. They're going to do everything in their power to really try and make Will Howard beat them by making accurate reads, being able to go through his progressions. And also, I think too, you're going to have the crowd. You're going to have the crowd at Autzen Stadium, which is one of the hardest places in the country to play college football. You're going to have that crowd on your side too. So when I look at this Oregon team, I think they're going to try to attack Will Howard from a bunch of different angles. But I think really that's the fundamental angle of this game. It's going to be Ohio's offensive line versus Oregon's defensive line. To me, that's the real key fundamental matchup that I think everybody is talking about, and that's what I'm going to be talking about too. Because obviously, you know, there's obviously no need to make up a storyline when the storyline we know what the storyline is. So I think that's obviously the most important thing. But then if we're shifting a little bit more towards the Oregon side, I mean, Dylan Gabriel, he beat Texas last year. He has the highest completion percentage in all of college football, 77.8%, 11 touchdowns with 3 interceptions, 1,449 yards, which is all great. I mean, on the show, I try not to base everything on stats, but I think it's important to conceptualize exactly what they're doing statistically, so we kind of get a feel for where they're at right now. I mean, in terms of Oregon, they're in many ways in a similar boat as Ohio State. Whereas Ohio State, I rattled off that they played Akron, Western Michigan, Iowa, and whatnot too. But when you look at Oregon's schedule, I mean, they really had kind of a slow. I would argue they had a very slow start against first couple weeks versus Idaho, Boise State, and UCLA. I mean, they really didn't get going until approximately mid third quarter, early fourth quarter, which I definitely found alarming to an extent. But at the same time, too, you have to kind of think to yourself, well, it's beginning of the year. They're going to be seeing some different changes, and you know, it's Dylan Gabriel's first time in an Oregon uniform too. Now that he's all saddled in and whatnot. But I think if you're coming from an Oregon perspective, I think the one thing you have to be a little bit concerned about too, in terms of their offense, yes, they have a bunch of weapons. Yes, they know how to move the ball, and that's all. and that's all great. But I think there are a number of examples where I think Dylan Gabriel does show some vulnerability. I think one of the best examples you can think of in terms of, I briefly mentioned this before, both teams have played Michigan State, and I covered Michigan State a couple days ago. So I am pretty familiar with, the intricacies of Michigan State and, what they've looked like this year. But one of the biggest, but one of the things that I'm going to throw out there is the fact that when Oregon played Michigan State last Friday night, he threw a pair of end zone interceptions that definitely caught my attention a little bit too. Especially when you look at the Idaho and Boise State game too, there are a couple of times where Dylan Gabriel, I think he even saw this to an extent when he was at Oklahoma too, is that I think a lot of the time he is just tries to force things that necessarily aren't there. And the problem you're going to have is when you're facing a team like the Buckeyes, you're not going to you really have to maximize the chances you have out there, because Ohio State right now is ranked 11th in the country on third downs. And also Ohio State has probably the best secondary in the entire country, and what I would certainly call an elite secondary. And if Dylan Gabriel, when you're timing up these routes and these plays, if he's even off by half a second, he's gonna that Ohio State secondary is gonna make him pay like Michigan State did. I mean, ultimately, it didn't necessarily cost him the game or anything, because Michigan State can't move the football whatsoever right now. But I think that's, even if you're looking at that macrocosm of the Michigan State game, I think it can translate really well to this bigger game too. Now that College Game Day is going to be in Eugene, in terms of the national presence, it's definitely going to be a game that everybody in the country is going to have their eyes on. And most importantly, I mean, I definitely want to give Oregon's defense some credit too. I mean, they're ranked number 10th nationally in the country right now, so they're not a bunch of slackers either. I think what fascinates me the most about this is, I would certainly argue, if I can play only one game right now, I would rather have Dylan Gabriel than Will Howard too, because I think like Josh Pate said on his college football show, which I certainly recommend you watching if you don't. But you know, I think with Will Howard, the storyline's going to be, is he going to be the game manager or the game owner? Whereas Dylan Gabriel, his question's going to be, is he going to be is he going to be the gunslinger, or is he going to be a turnover machine? Because if he does anything similar to you know what he's done, to what he did in Michigan State, I mean, one can make the argument that you turn the ball over against Ohio State, that's at least 10 to 14 points right there. And in a game where you can have such big swings, and when it's so evenly matched up on paper, the margin for error in this game is going to be so thin, to the point where it could come down to a missed field goal, or a late Dylan Gabriel or Will Howard interception, where it's simply going to happen because it's going to be, or a strip sack or a covered sack or something to that effect, where, you know, one of these two quarterbacks are going to have to put the game on their shoulders. Now, granted, to me, like I said before, Ohio State has the most weapons right now in the entire country. And, when you look at it too, at least from the coach's perspective, Ryan Day is 17-8 against top 25 teams, where Dan Lanning is 7-5. So in terms of a full circle sort of spin, there is certainly more pressure on Ryan Day and Ohio State, especially there's been such callings for Ohio State to finally get over the hump and really win a national championship. And I would certainly argue, compared to the last, you know, 10 years or so, I mean, this is the most talented roster that they've had, and this is really the best opportunity they have, especially when you have a Michigan team who's behind right now. And outside of them, I mean, your biggest competition is a 6-0 Indiana team, who has certainly exceeded expectations, and Kirk Cignetti deserves a ton of credit for that. But, they're just not at that level right now. But in terms of, in terms of Ohio State's schedule, I mean, they still have to play Penn State, and they still have to play Michigan too. Whereas from Oregon's perspective, Oregon still has to play. I think they have a little bit of a tougher course going in. I mean, you still have to play a really tough Illinois team. You still have Michigan. You play Maryland, and I forgot to mention too, Ohio State also has to play North. I think Northwest. They have to play Northwestern, Purdue, and a couple other teams too. But in terms of the actual, you know, in terms of them actually getting to the Big Ten championship game, I think this game could ultimately decide who faces Penn State in the Big Ten championship game. Because, I think a couple months from now, maybe a month or two from now, we're going to be probably talking about, either Ohio State or Oregon still being undefeated. And then we're going to be talking about, Penn State or one of these other teams possibly having one loss. And then you're all kind of deciding, because there's no divisions anymore, you're pretty much saying out of these three teams, who's really going to be representing the Big Ten in the conference championship game without having that. Because at this point too, it's it's exciting too, because both these quarterbacks, it's such a huge stage for him. And I do think in some regards, Dylan Gabriel has been on that stage before. And, he knows what it's like to be in this situation too. And when you have the home crowd and the home field advantage, I think if you ask me, I think Oregon has a slight edge over Ohio State right now. But at the same time, if Chip Kelly develops a game plan where it's one where Will Howard can execute it without having too many turnovers, and you know you also make sure that you're getting Henderson and Judkins involved too. I mean, obviously that's going to be part of the game plan no matter what. But I would not be surprised if there's some certain situations where you're using Henderson and Judkins to expand the field a little bit more to really get that perhaps a play action involved, for example, where if that offensive line can hold Oregon up a little bit longer, I definitely anticipate seeing, you know, Oregon having some zone reads in that middle of the field, particularly being open, and Will Howard being able to get some quality reads. But with all that said, this is definitely the biggest marquee matchup that we're going to see this week. Two evenly competitive teams, but at the moment, I definitely have Oregon slightly ahead, because right now they're sixth in pressure rate right now, so I do anticipate them getting some pressure on Will Howard. Although Ohio State's offensive line has done a phenomenal job with protecting him and reassuring that they're all coming together there too. But you also probably have the healthiest Oregon team that you're going to have at this point too. So, like I said before, look for the quarterback matchup between Will Howard and Dylan Gabriel. Who's going to make less mistakes and who wins that battle in the trenches is ultimately going to determine who wins this game. But I'd say Oregon give them a slight edge